Container traffic from China to the U.S. surged by 277% in early May. Cargo ships are full. Warehouses are busy. Supply chains are moving again. And yet, prices at your local store haven't dropped. Gas is still expensive. Eggs cost the same. And that credit card bill? Still growing. According to Reuters, in May 2025, a temporary trade deal between the U.S. and China cut tariffs for 90 days. The move was meant to cool tensions and ease inflation. But what if all it did was create a flood of imported goods, with none of the savings passed on? Some say it's a step toward stability. Others wonder if it's just a pause before the next blow. Meanwhile, American families are paying the same for less. And here's the bigger question. If prices aren't dropping even when tariffs are lowered, who's really benefiting? You'll see how this relief may be hiding a deeper shift, and why the real cost might not be visible until it's too late. On May 12th, the U.S. and China reached a 90-day trade agreement. According to Reuters, tariffs on Chinese goods were cut from 145% to 30%, and U.S. goods entering China dropped from 125% to 10%. This pause was framed as a cooling period, a window to de-escalate. But for American importers, it meant one thing: move fast before the tariffs come back. And they did. Container orders from China to the U.S. jumped 277% in just days. Ports like Yantian and Shenzhen are now congested again, just like during the height of pandemic demand. Freight companies welcomed the rush. Retailers filled their inventories. The supply chain looked alive. But something's missing. Consumers aren't feeling it. Prices in grocery stores, hardware outlets, and auto shops haven't followed the same trend. Why? Because this wasn't a supply shortage problem. It was a cost chain problem. A sudden rush of goods doesn't erase markups. It doesn't fix margin expectations. And it certainly doesn't undo months of inflation-driven pricing strategies. Retailers aren't rushing to cut prices. In fact, some are using this surge to refill stock at lower cost, while keeping prices high to recoup earlier losses. At the same time, Fed officials have made no changes to the interest rate. Rates remain at 4.3%, signaling they believe inflation is still a threat. So while the shipping lanes are moving, the wallets at home are still under pressure. For working-class Americans, this economic thaw isn't translating to relief. Not yet. And that leaves a simple but serious question. If this is what a truce looks like, what happens when the next tariff wave hits? You'd think a break in the trade war would lower prices. Cargo is moving. Tariffs are down. More supply should mean less cost. But for millions of Americans, the price tags haven't changed. Not on groceries. Not on household goods. Not even on things that supposedly got cheaper at the dock. Here's why. The cost of goods in stores isn't just about the price at the port. It's layered through financing, distribution, wages, rent, and profit expectations. Even if a retailer gets a pallet of goods 10% cheaper, they're not cutting prices until they need to, because those goods are filling shelves next to products bought months ago at peak tariff levels. And many of those businesses are still recovering from high-interest loans, squeezed margins, and rising operating costs. According to the Federal Reserve in May 2025, the average small business interest rate on working capital loans remained above 8.4%. That's more than double what it was 5 years ago. This financial drag gets passed on to consumers quietly, steadily, and across the board, not because of greed, but because the system is running on borrowed oxygen. So even with ships arriving full, the relief never touches the checkout counter. Instead, it sinks into debts, into profits delayed, into spreadsheets that demand price stability no matter what's happening at customs. That's the first cost. But it's not the only one. American families are also paying with their trust. They hear tariff relief and expect breathing room. When that doesn't happen, confidence erodes. And the long-term impact of that is harder to measure until it shows up in savings rates, loan defaults, or spending paralysis. There's another layer here worth mentioning. While the U.S. is struggling with sticky inflation, China is dealing with something far worse: overproduction, deflation, and investor flight. Factories in China are churning out goods, not because demand is strong, but because collapse isn't an option for them. This is important, because some of the cheap goods flooding into U.S. ports are coming from a desperate exporter. And desperate exporters don't play by market rules. They dump, they undercut, they distort. So maybe this temporary tariff cut isn't a gift. Maybe it's a test of who can outlast whom. That raises a hard but necessary question. Are American consumers being asked to hold the line in the short term, so the economy can become more resilient long term? Or are they just collateral damage in a global standoff with no clear end? The truth is, we don't know yet, but the discomfort is real, and someone is already paying. When the U.S. and China announced a 90-day tariff pause, the headlines framed it as a win for both sides. Less tension, more trade, lower prices. But who really wins when ships move, shelves refill, and prices don't fall? It's not the average shopper. And it's certainly not the person trying to stretch a paycheck across rising rents, higher grocery bills, and credit card debt. Let's look closer. Retail giants used the pause to fill warehouses at reduced cost. But instead of passing those savings to customers, they held prices steady, protecting profit margins still bruised from last year's inflation spike. Some even used the excuse of supply volatility to maintain or increase prices, despite getting cheaper inventory. According to corporate earnings reports filed in Q1 2025, several major retailers reported stronger than expected gross margins due to improved freight costs and inventory timing advantages. In plain terms, they bought cheap and sold high. Meanwhile, shipping firms locked in new contracts. Freight brokers, logistics platforms, and port operators all benefited from the sudden rush of demand. Their gain? Guaranteed revenue no matter what the customer ends up paying. And the Fed stood still. Rates stayed high. Inflation stayed sticky. The financial system, in effect, benefited from households continuing to spend without relief. So where does that leave ordinary Americans? Still waiting, still paying, still hoping this pause becomes more than a headline. But here's the harder truth. Some of this may be intentional. By allowing supply chains to briefly unfreeze, Washington might be trying to reset the board without looking like it's backing down. A kind of pressure valve release. Enough to avoid panic, not enough to fix the problem. And if China is indeed using this moment to unload goods at any price because its own economy is cracking, then the U.S. may be preparing for a deeper decoupling strategy that takes years, not months. In that scenario, someone needs to absorb the short-term friction. And right now, it's the American consumer, quietly, steadily, and across income levels. But if you're feeling frustrated, you're not alone. Millions are asking the same thing. If this is the relief phase, what does pain look like? It's hard not to feel like we're on the outside of a deal meant to help us. And if the real beneficiaries are corporate margins, freight firms, and policymakers playing chess at the global level, then maybe we were never meant to win this round at all. Still, one thing is clear. Short-term pain isn't always a mistake. Sometimes it's a strategy. The question is, who's writing the playbook? And how long are everyday Americans expected to wait before they see a return? If the pause in tariffs was meant to offer relief, American families aren't feeling it. At the household level, the pain is subtle but constant. Prices aren't dropping. Credit card balances are rising. And the small uptick in supply hasn't translated into breathing room. For people living paycheck to paycheck, this creates a dangerous feedback loop. You go to the store expecting lower prices. Instead, you pay the same, if not more, while your income remains flat. So you swipe the card again and again. According to the Federal Reserve, in April 2025, household credit card balances reached $1.36 trillion, the highest level ever recorded. And with interest rates still hovering above 21%, that's not just a bill. It's a trap. But it doesn't stop at credit. Landlords, utility companies, and service providers have built new pricing models based on the inflation of the last 2 years. Even if import costs are easing, their pricing won't adjust overnight. So the costs that were once temporary are now baked into everyday life. This puts working Americans in a bind. especially those in mid-sized cities where wages haven't caught up to cost of living shifts. Take the service economy. Restaurant workers, delivery drivers, retail employees. They're now spending more on essentials than they were during the pandemic, despite a supposed return to normal. Many are working second jobs just to hold the line. And what happens when consumers start pulling back? Businesses notice. Small shops see sales decline. Contract workers lose hours. Even large chains begin adjusting forecasts, cutting back on hiring or delaying raises. It moves fast, but it starts quiet. You won't hear it on the news. You'll feel it in local malls, at the gas pump, or in the grocery aisle where coupons no longer make a dent. Then comes the second wave, institutional pressure. When consumer demand weakens, banks see changes too. Loan applications slow, defaults creep up, and suddenly what started as price fatigue becomes a credit tightening cycle. Meanwhile, the government is trying to walk a tightrope. They want to manage inflation, avoid recession, and maintain leverage against China all at once. But there's only so much economic pain you can shift around before it starts piling up in the same places. Middle-income households, rural towns with little industry left, urban neighborhoods still recovering from COVID-era closures. This is where confidence begins to crack. Not in the headlines, but in the kitchen table conversations. When people start questioning whether the system even notices them, trust becomes harder to restore. And this is where the trade story meets something deeper, the American psyche. Because when people hear tariff relief and feel nothing change, it creates a fracture. It reinforces the belief that economic decisions are made elsewhere for someone else. And that kind of erosion doesn't just hurt next quarter's retail numbers. It bleeds into voter turnout, civic engagement, and even public health, because financial stress finds its way into every part of life. Still, it's not all loss. Some economists argue that this discomfort is part of a necessary adjustment. That by absorbing short-term pressure, the U.S. can build a more resilient domestic supply chain and reduce reliance on unstable foreign markets. Maybe they're right. Maybe what we're feeling now is a difficult but strategic shift toward long-term security. But strategy or not, families still have to get through the month. They still need to buy gas, groceries, and school supplies. They still need to feel like this pain leads somewhere better. So yes, the freight is moving. But for many, the economy still feels stuck. The ships have arrived. The ports are busy. The tariffs are down, at least for now. But for everyday Americans, the numbers on receipts haven't moved. And that gap between policy and daily life is growing harder to ignore. Maybe this is the cost of economic transition. Maybe it's a strategic pause to outlast a vulnerable competitor. Or maybe this is what happens when global trade is recalibrated and households are left to carry the difference. If the future means less dependence on fragile supply chains and foreign leverage, then yes, some discomfort is inevitable. But for working families, that discomfort is happening now. And the benefits, they're still out of reach. So the question is no longer, will prices fall? It's, how long are we expected to wait? And what are we really waiting for? If you felt this pressure, if your grocery bill hasn't changed, or your paycheck still feels too thin, share your story. Because behind every economic policy is a human cost. And that story starts with the people who live it, not the ones who legislate it.